I made over 50 of these isometric buildings in Procreate, and I'm going to walk you through how I made them by giving you a deep dive into my process and telling you the best tips alongside. I've been working on my Curious Cabins project over the last 2 to 3 years. It's my biggest coherent art project to date, and I learned a lot doing it. Today, we'll watch a time-lapse of the process of making noodles. That's the name of the artwork, this one. Let's start by taking a look at my sketchbook page. This series is heavily influenced by architecture styles. In fact, I started it to discover and learn more about different types of architecture. For this building, the initial spark was drawing a little ramen shop, so I looked up references for cute Japanese townhouses. One of my creative principles or strategies is mixing up well-known and usual elements with surprising things. So I thought instead of just the shop, I could make huge ramen noodles pouring out of the windows and doors. This way, the scene gets a whole new surreal touch. Alright, here's my rough and as always very ugly first thumbnail. Now I apply another sketch layer to it, but much more detailed. It's really up to you how you make your scribbles and sketches. I like to have it very precise. However, I recommend to not use a too fine brush here, as you easily get lost in details, while this part of the process is more for figuring out the rough elements of the scene. Isometric art is great for two things, among others: telling stories and working with details. And both go incredibly well together. By stories, I don't mean telling your audience a whole novel, it's more subtle. Let's take a look. There's laundry hanging on the line, there's a cramped balcony with a satellite dish. It looks like the shop owners may live in the upper floor. Maybe it's an old couple living and working in this small place. Here's some plant pots, maybe they grow their own herbs for the ramen bowls. And the oversized noodles. Maybe something went wrong, or this is just their shop's funny USB. Anyway, it sparks wonder and thought in the viewer's brain, and that's a win for the artist. In this case, for me, hopefully. Once I'm happy with the balance of the overall composition and the amount of details, I move on to outlining. For the whole Curious Cabins series, I always use my Tony Montana brush from my plastic brush pack. There's a link in the description. Oh, and while you're scrolling down there, I'd really appreciate a like on this video. Thanks. In the outlining process, I try to not focus on one area of the illustration to be completed first. Instead, I do a certain amount of elements and then move on. This makes it much easier for me to find the right amount of details later on. Follow the process and compare it to the final outlines on the left. For an art style relying on details as much as mine, I find it important to balance them out as best as possible and identify areas with more details contrasting areas with more white space. I draw everything on one layer at this point. I use a second layer if I have overlaying elements, so I can erase the part that will be covered later on, instead of drawing around it. Let's watch me drawing the outlines for a bit until I'm finished. If you'd like to skip forward, just select the next chapter. By the way, how do you like this type of video? Would you like to dive deeper into specific aspects of the process within a longer video? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Outlines done, colors next. For the color palette of my oversized noodles house, I want to go with a softer contrast and a relatively analogous color palette. This means I'm picking colors from the color wheel that are neighboring each other's. The range is quite wide here and covers almost half of the color wheel, but you'll still see later on that the color palette will look harmonious. One reason for that is that the colors all have a similar saturation. If you'd like to learn more about this, take a look at my new book Lines. It's a coloring book including several guides to finding striking color palettes. And it's crowdfunding right now. Link in the description. So we got the palette ready to fill the outlines. As you see here, I first got a more brown red in the beginning. I'm going to change that later on into a more rust red direction. The emphasis on the palette is clearly on the red hues, while purple is very prominent, but secondary. Working with a dominant color and additional spot colors is a great way to make an artwork look interesting. I also decided to add some yellows to the noodles and a few other elements. I think it just puts more focus on the noodles. Keep this in mind and see if it works for you when looking at the final artwork later on. On the left you see the final flat coloring. Next up is adding shadows. I use a layer set to multiply mode and a tinted color for the shades. You can see my layers on the left. As you see, I use a clipping mask with a solid color on the shadows, so I can change the shadow's color anytime I want and do easy adjustments later on. Using an actual color and not just gray is key here, as I can give the artwork an impulse on the light temperature and overall mood. The final touches are adding reflections, some textures and a bit of steam coming out of the kitchen. This took me around 9 to 10 hours from first sketch to final artwork. I hope you like the result. You can certainly do this with Midjourney, but I bet you won't have as much fun as me. Thanks for watching and see you soon.